Luke 11:37. The chapter began with the disciples asking Jesus to teach them to pray. And as he was teaching them lessons on prayer, he was interrupted by a man who was possessed of an unclean spirit. And Jesus cast the demon out. And the Pharisees in their hearts were trying to figure out how he had done it, and they had concluded that he did it by the power of Satan. But Jesus showed the fallacy of their logic. And then a woman interrupted as she cried out, "Blessed is the womb that bare you and the breast from which you nursed." And Jesus turned the attention away from his mother and upon those who would just keep the commandments of the Lord. The crowd then began to ask for a sign, and Jesus spoke to them about the only sign they were going to get, the sign of the prophet Jonah. He then went back to the subject of prayer, concluding with that subject of prayer. And as he spoke, verse 37, a certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and sat down to eat. Jesus was never one to refuse a dinner invitation. He seemed to especially enjoy eating with people. And I am certain that not for the food's sake, but for the intimacy of fellowship that was experienced around the table. The opportunity of interaction, as so often around the table, just there is that interchange that is warm, that is close, that is intimate. Especially in that culture, where to them eating together constituted becoming one with each other. And so Jesus went to eat at the house of the Pharisee. And the Pharisee was surprised, it said. He was surprised that Jesus had not first washed before dinner. Now, they did not have utensils in those days. They ate with their hands. But the Pharisee wasn't concerned with cleanliness. He was surprised that Jesus didn't go through the ceremonial washing. For they had a regular procedure that they went through. A ceremonial washing of their hands before they ate. It wasn't just to remove the dirt. There was just a whole ceremony attached to the thing. And for the ceremonial washings, they had a stone vase that was filled with water. You just didn't use any water because it might be unclean. So the water in these stone vases were kept exclusively for the ceremonial cleansings. And first of all, you would rub your hands up and down while someone would pour a quarter of a log of of water over your hands, and you'd rub them up and down so that the water running over from your fingertips would drip off of your wrist. And then you would take and wash the palms of your hands by rubbing your fist into each palm. And then the washing was concluded by your hands down, and now beginning at your wrist, pouring the water over and dripping off your fingers with your hands down. And that was the ceremonial washing ritual that they would go through before they would eat. And Jesus didn't go through this little ritual. And thus the fellow was rather alarmed. He was surprised that Jesus just sat down to eat without going through this ceremonial ritual of washing his hands as they do in their ceremony. Now, for a Pharisee to omit the slightest part of this ritual, to him it would be sin. I mean, they just kept the thing so precise and so exact, and if he didn't do so, then it would be sin. So Jesus said to him, verse 39, "Now you Pharisees make the outside of the cup and the dish clean, but your inward part is full of greed and wickedness." There are people that are much the same today. They're so interested in the impression that they make on others. Their chief interest is their outward appearance, and their whole life is spent in an outward show. They spend their lives trying to make good impressions. But they're like the Hollywood movie sets. They may look very real from the front, but you go behind and you see it's just a set. There's nothing behind it. It's just framework, just 2x4s and rugged lumber. But from the front, it looks like it's a little western town, you know. And yet, behind it, there is nothing. And there are a lot of people that are that way. They put up a front. They look very real and genuine. But you start digging in and you find there's an emptiness. There's nothing there. And with the Pharisees, Jesus said, look, you make the outside of the cup and the dishes so clean, but within, you're just filled with greed and uncleanness. The Bible tells us that man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. These people were very interested and very concerned that their outward appearance be just so that they go through the ceremony. People watch them and say, oh my, isn't he righteous? You know, look, he holds his hand just right when he holds them up and rubs them just, oh my, so righteous. And yet within, Jesus said, there's all this rottenness. And where man is looking on the outward appearance, God is looking on the heart. And God sees what's inside. And God is far more concerned with what is in your heart than what is on the outside of your life. Jesus said, foolish ones, verse 40. Did not he who made the outside make the inside also? God who created us both inside and out. And God who created us is interested in what is inside of a man as well as what is on the outside of a man. And really, I should be far more concerned about what God thinks of me than what man thinks of me. And yet, isn't it interesting how so often we're seeking to make a good impression on man, but we seem to be totally oblivious of God's impressions of us. We want to make a good show before man, and we think, ha, they saw me, that's great. They'll really think I'm wonderful. But what does God think of you? Knowing your motives, knowing your heart, what does God think of you? And I should be far more concerned of what God thinks of me than what man thinks of me. And many times, man's estimate of us is far different than his estimate of us. Many times, his estimate of us is different from our own estimate of ourselves. As with the church of Laodicea, they said, "We are rich. We are increased with goods. We have need of nothing." Jesus said, "You don't realize that you're wretched, you're miserable, you're poor, you're naked, and you're blind." What a vast divergence of the two. What they were saying about themselves and what Jesus was saying about them. How they were seeing themselves and how Jesus was seeing them. I often wonder, how does Jesus see me? I'm very concerned as how he sees me. I do not want to be deceived about myself. I do not want to have one opinion of myself and he have a totally different opinion. I don't want to see myself as a pretty good guy and he see me as a rat. That is why the psalmist said, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." Why? Because he knew that he didn't even know his own heart. It's so easy for us to just deceive ourselves. Oh God, reveal to me the truth. Show me, Lord, what is on the inward parts. Help me, God. Now, they had a false concept. And Jesus, in verse 41, declares this false concept that they had. He said, "You give alms of such things as you have, and then indeed you believe that all things are clean to you." Just because you pay your tithes, just because you go through the rituals, you think then that everything is clean to you. You think you're all right. You think within you're okay. Because I am observing some outward ritual, then inside I'm okay. Everything is clean to you just because you pay your tithes, just because you give. Sort of an idea that you more or less purchase your righteous standing before God. That you sort of buy your way into God's favor. This was a tragic mistake that was made by the church in that period of church history where they began to sell indulgences. As they wanted to raise money to build St. Peter's Basilica, the church began to sell the indulgences. And as long as you purchased an indulgence, you could go out and sin. Don't have to worry about it. And Jesus was here showing the fallacy of their whole thought patterns. Just because you give alms, you think you're clean, But that is not the case. And so he goes on to amplify that thought a bit, first of all declaring the first of the three woes that he pronounced upon the Pharisees. But woe to you Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and you pass by justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. So they had this concept that their giving made everything all right. He said, woe unto you, because you do pay your tithes of your mint, your rue. Now, according to the law, they didn't have to pay tithes on rue. It was just a minor spice. But these guys would go out to their spice gardens, and they would even pay tithes from their spice gardens. So careful to give God his part of their tithes. They were meticulous in their tithing. But they totally overlooked the inside, fairness, justice, the love of God. Now, Jesus said, this you ought to have done. There are those who say, well, tithing is not a New Testament teaching. Tithing belongs to the law. Two mistakes. Tithing doesn't belong to the law. It antedated the law. Tithing began hundreds of years before the law was ever given. Abraham tithed of all that he had unto Melchizedek, long before the law of tithing was ever declared. Tithing is in the New Testament. As Jesus spoke of them tithing even of the little things, their spice gardens, he said concerning their tithing, you ought to do it. And so he enforced tithing as something that a person ought to do. This you ought to have done. But where they made their mistake is in what they weren't interested in or weren't doing. Today, there are a lot of people who go through all of the motions outwardly of Christianity. They attend church, they tithe faithfully, they partake of the Lord's communion, they go through all of the outward ordinances of the church, and are very scrupulous in doing so. Yet within, their hearts are filled with bitterness, filled with anger, filled with jealousies, filled with strife. And yet they have a sense of well-being because they pay their tithes, and you talk to them about their life. Oh, well, I never miss church. I even go weeknights. And check my tithing record. And because they are taking care of the outward part, they don't seem to be concerned that within is all of this bitterness and all of this horrible, horrible, detestable attitudes that God abhors. Now, the Lord is far more interested in what is going on inside of your life than what is happening on the outside. Because true conversion is a matter of the heart. It isn't a matter of doing the right things outwardly. It's the matter of a changed heart within. And the Lord is interested in fairness. The Lord is interested in God's love being perfected in your life and flowing forth from your life. God is far more interested in your being loving and giving in a loving way than He is of your paying tithes or attending church or reading your Bible or anything else. It's what's on the inside, Jesus is emphasizing here, that really matters with God. And this is, of course, where Jesus was always bumping heads with the Pharisees, because their whole system was based on the outward rituals and the outward observances of all of these various little washing rituals and things of this nature. And Jesus said, no, that doesn't do anything. It's what's in your heart that really counts and matters before God. Woe unto you, because you're deceived, you're mistaken, because you're paying your tithes of these things. You think you're all right, you think you're clean, but you're not. The second woe, in verse 43. Woe to you, Pharisees! For you love the best seats in the synagogues and the greetings in the marketplaces. Again, you see, it's this thing of show. In the synagogue, the men sat on the one side and the women sat on the other side. And the best seats in the synagogue was the front row, because you were more obvious there than any place else. And these guys loved to sit in the front row of the synagogue, where everybody could see them and observe them sitting there and think, my, look at how righteous they are, you know. And they loved these greetings in the marketplaces. Wearing their robes, wearing their phylacteries, wearing their outward symbols of religion, so that the people passing by them in the marketplace would pay homage to them, bowing and, Reverend, nice to see you. Woe unto you, he said, because you're only looking for the public recognition and honor, but you're not looking for the honor that comes from God. You're seeking to impress man, but you're not concerned about God. The third woe, verse 44, and in this one, he's getting heated up here, really. I mean, he's beginning to go at it now. He's getting into it, and he started off, but it's coming. Woe to you! And now there's some lawyers around there too, so he throws them in. You scribes and Pharisees, and then he says, hypocrites. So he's really getting into it. For you are like graves which are not seen, and the men who walk over them are not aware of them. Now, what is he talking about? What does he mean? The Jews have tremendous respect for the dead. Today, even in Jerusalem, one of the biggest problems that the archaeologists have are the Orthodox rabbis who oftentimes picket against archaeological digs because they are fearful that they might be digging up some graves. So whenever they are involved in archaeological digs, the rabbis are always standing there in case they uncover a bone that might be a human bone. And when they do, everything comes to a dead stop. And the rabbi takes over. And of course, they hallow this bone and they carry it out and they give it another burial and so forth. But it's something they have this tremendous respect. But in the law, if a person touched a grave, he was considered unclean for 7 days. That is, you could not go in to worship God within the temple for 7 days. You were ceremonially unclean. Now, they were shocked that Jesus didn't go through the little ceremony to cleanse his hands. You just can't wash your hands with soap and water. That doesn't count. You got to wash them the certain way. Make sure that the water doesn't even run up your arms, but it runs off the hands and down, and then runs off the fingertips. And, you got to do it that way or you're not really clean. And so they were so interested in this ceremonial cleanliness. Now, Jesus really hits them. He says, you guys are like graves that people can't see. Which means that people come around you and you have a polluting effect upon them. You're making them unclean. You're so worried and concerned with cleanliness. But you are like graves that aren't seen, and people are walking over and they don't realize that they are ceremonially unclean by their contact with you. Of course, they understood immediately and completely what he was talking about as he was laying this trip on them. Graves which are not seen, men who walk over them are not aware of them. And so people have this uncleanness. They're not even aware of the fact that they are unclean. And so, again, interested in the externals, they were missing the most important thing as far as God is concerned, what's going on in the person's heart. And tonight, that's God's concern with you. What's going on in your heart? That you are here, that you are studying of the Word is good. That you took communion is good. That you ought to do. But what's going on in your heart? You see, doing these things is totally meaningless if in your heart God's love is not working. You're not interested in really being fair, being righteous, being just, being honest. Paul the Apostle said concerning the taking of communion, that we ought to examine ourselves before we come to the table. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged of God. Many people, he said, actually eat of the bread and drink of the cup unworthily. They go through the outward observance, but within their hearts, there isn't that purity, that moral uprightness, that which God desires to be within our hearts and lives. We're holding bitterness. We're holding animosities. We're holding feelings of anger or grudging against our brothers, and yet we partake. But we need to examine ourselves, and we need to ask the Holy Spirit to examine our hearts. Because that's what God is interested in. And that's what God is looking at tonight. Jesus isn't through. One of the lawyers made the mistake of asking, "What about us?" So he laid it on them too. And we'll get that next week as he says, "Hey, you added us. You talked about scribes, you've included us." And Jesus said, "Well, here, let me tell you about yourselves." And he went on to lay the trip on them. So next week we'll continue on as Jesus denounces the lawyers. Shall we stand? Now again, I would encourage you, as did James, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Hey, that was really good tonight, wasn't it? Man, it really caused you to start thinking about what's going on inside. Yeah, wow, No good unless it brings some changes within, you see. You go right out and go right back into the same bitterness and the same attitudes of anger and so forth. It's no value at all. Even though you may have seen something tonight by the Spirit. The Spirit showed you an area of your life that needs correction. And you say, "Oh boy, yeah, I've got to take care of that." But if you go out and don't do anything about it, then you're no better off. Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. It's a very deceptive thing. Thinking, well, I'm going to change that, but not changing it. Being convicted of something and not doing anything about it. Well, I was convicted of that. Man, I was really convicted of that. Yeah, well, what did it do? Well, I was convicted, man. Yeah, but what changes did it bring? Well, I was under heavy conviction, man. Well, you see, you can deceive yourself unless there are actual changes that transpire. The man who is a hearer of the word and not a doer is like a man who looks in the mirror, sees the truth about himself, but the minute he walks away, he forgets what he saw. For a moment, the truth is revealed, but so quickly, you forget the truth of what you saw, what the Spirit revealed. Let's not just let it be a truth that flashed across our heart, but let us actually ask God to work in our hearts, cleansing us within, making us within as He would have us to be. Let's be far more concerned about what's inside. Because if what is going on inside is right and pure, the outside will follow. God's interest is your heart. Let Him work within your heart tonight, putting away all malice and strife and anger and envies and jealousies. Let's walk in love, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven us. Loving one another, even as Christ loved us and gave Himself for us. Let there be that work of God's Spirit within our hearts, for Jesus' sake, and for God's sake.